Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of the book Small-Wheeled Pedal Machines, A Better Way of Cycling. But what I want to do in this video is turn all that on its head, and I want to talk about some of the negatives of having small wheels on a bike. I think they're well outweighed by the advantages, but if you ignore the negatives, then I don't think you're being fair when you're actually addressing the issue. So let's cover 3 different negatives, and I want to respond and show how you offset those negatives. The first negative is that a small-wheeled bike has lighter wheels. Now you might think that's a positive, isn't it? You know, lighter wheels speed them up more easily, less weight of the bike, but it does have one negative, and that is smaller wheels have less gyroscopic effect. Because there's less weight spinning around, the bike will behave slightly differently. Now, the biggest difference is that the steering will be quicker, because when you turn the steering, turn the handlebars, there's less gyroscopic resistance. That means that the bike, for people who aren't used to a small-wheeled bike, might even feel a bit twitchy. And it also means that typically riding a small-wheeled bike is harder no hands. When you take your hands off the steering wheel, the handlebars, you know what I mean, the steering is less damped, it's more likely to oscillate. So a small-wheeled bike does feel different because the wheels have less gyroscopic effect. The second one is not very major, but it does get brought up quite a lot. The hubs, the axles, the bearings, if it's a hub gears, the gearbox is closer to the ground and so closer to contamination. It's more easy to get dirt and water into the hub of a small-wheeled bike because it's simply closer to where that dirt and water actually is. How do you offset that? Well, obviously pretty easy, isn't it? You keep the bike clean, you keep the seals in good condition, and then there really aren't any disadvantages in that area, not in the real world. What about, though, the fact that a bike with smaller diameter wheels has lower gearing? Now this is a fallacy. People say, well, if you've got small wheels, you always have to pedal like a maniac to get anywhere. But that's just what the gearing is that's been selected. If the gearing that has been selected is low, then yes, you will have to pedal fast to get anywhere or to go fast. But if you select gearing that's appropriate to the fact that the bike is running small wheels, then there's no drama at all. You can have exactly the same gearing in gear inches or meters of development as you can with a big wheeled bike. So it's just the components that you actually select. But here is probably the most important disadvantage to consider. Bikes with smaller wheels have a higher rolling resistance and tend to have a harder ride. So let's look at those two things. The higher rolling resistance comes because the wheel sinks in more easily. If you imagine pedaling through sand, a small bike, a bike with small wheels will sink in more easily than a bike with big wheels. So on soft surfaces, certainly small-wheeled bikes are at a disadvantage. What about on hard surfaces? Well, it very much depends on the tyre pressures you're running. If you run high tyre pressures on a small-wheeled bike, you'll have about the same rolling resistance as is typically achieved on a large-wheeled bike. But if you run higher tyre pressures, and if the wheels are smaller and therefore are more inclined to fall into holes, it becomes really important that you have suspension. Now you're thinking, oh, this is getting pretty complicated. In another video, I cover the advantages of small-wheeled bikes, and they are absolutely manifest. So what about this small wheels falling into holes and having a harder ride? Well, if you pick a small-wheeled bike that has got a good quality suspension, a Birdie, a Moulton, a Brompton's got suspension on the back wheel, then you'll find that the ride quality is quite fine. But, and here's a really big but, if you buy a cheap, nasty small-wheeled bike, they've probably got big balloon tyres on it to try and give a decent ride, the rolling resistance will be even higher, the ride won't be very good, and it will be very easy to ride a bike like that and say, oh, small-wheeled bikes are terrible. Look, I rode one and it was awful. So if you are going to pick a small-wheeled bike, and I think, as I say, the advantages are enormous, you've got to be careful. You've got to be careful to pick one that has high quality tyres and wheels that run at high pressure, and preferably, especially if you have back pain or get headaches from riding normal bikes, you really want one with good quality suspension to iron out those road bumps. Not the sort of suspension going off-road, a mountain bike, not that sort of suspension, but a quality small deflection suspension that gives you that smooth ride even when you're running high tyre pressures that in turn give you lower rolling resistance. So A typical person who's ridden a cheap and nasty small-wheeled bike and gets off and says, well, that's horrible, I don't want to ride anything like that. A very common occurrence. You've really got to pick your small-wheeled bike with care to make sure that the designers have taken into account what are the negatives of small-wheeled bikes, and then of course you can enjoy all the huge advantages of small-wheeled bikes: the better load carrying capacity, the greater nimbleness, the far better ability to store, the ease with which they can be folded or pulled apart for transport. Those are the real advantages. But you also, when selecting a small-wheeled bike, need to consider the intrinsic disadvantages and make sure the designer has more than offset those, so that you has a whole package that's very, very effective as a bike. You can read about the advantages, you can read about the disadvantages in my book, Small Wheeled Pedal Machines, A Better Way of Cycling. Thank you.